Okay, our speaker tonight is Mr. Brian Keator from up near New Milford, and an excellent Civil War historian. And I did a short documentary of his house. If you go to my website, you can see it. I believe it was built in the 1830s. But with that, Brian, you could take it away.
Thank you very much. And I would like to, first of all, say thank you for all coming out, to Dale, to the entire society for inviting me to do this lecture tonight. I would like to start off by saying, actually today, specifically, how extra grateful I am to be here tonight. I have a very unique self-sufficiency lifestyle, very close to anyhow, that allows me to spend every day with my horses and riding. And I thought about it for a moment even this morning, and I said, you know, you've got a lot to do today. Oh, I don't think you have time to get in a ride, but knowing me, I had to go ahead and squeeze in a ride this morning. And I hopped on the horse and was enjoying my day immensely before I think what is probably every equestrian's biggest fear. I atypically came out of the saddle and looked up to find that my foot was stuck in the stirrup. As the world seemed to be spinning around me, I cried out and I called out and I said, stop, 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 please, whoa, ho, what word can I use, please? And as it continued and continued and continued on, and my head was bouncing on the most hard stone, and my body was bouncing over everything, I said, you know what? This may genuinely be the end today. And if this is the end today, I just want to thank the Lord that it was doing something that I loved. But Lord, if it's not your will, please, anything, please send down a miracle that can alleviate me from this. And sure enough, I looked up and there were two human faces looking down at me. And I said, it is a genuine miracle. And both of them said out front of Walmart, yes, I've never seen a quarter last that long. With that being said, thank you so much for the invitation to be here tonight and for all of your attendance and coming out. I'd like to speak slowly and take time and deeply elaborate things by tradition, but tonight my particular lecture is actually what I call somewhat of a sampling from a number of more specialized lectures in which I do. So hopefully of all those in attendance, if there are particular interests in certain realms, hopefully I will have something to say tonight in your particular top specific subject. The title of tonight's lecture is Perpetuated Myths, Misunderstandings, and Misconceptions of the American Civil War. So with that being said, as the title may allude to, I wish to share what I feel are many of the completely and continuing perpetual myths during the war. So this will be focusing in the vast majority on fact. And as a historian, I like to say that even me personally, I am well known as I use the F word, fact, very rarely in scholarship. But a lot of tonight will be simply sharing facts which may create more questions or the complexities of this period in this war than necessarily resolve or make a conclusive statement or opinion. Vast difference between the two. With that being said, I think that it is only a reasonable place to start is, well, the cause of the war. This is still debated today. There are opinions out there which I find utterly absurd. There are other opinions which mix truth and fact. And all I can speak is to share little known facts and allow you to make your decision or your desire to do further research. As a military historian, I also like to joke, I have a sense of humor. I like to say if you can find two hairy men that threw rocks at each other, I've studied it to some degree. But this war will always be my forte and my specialist, perhaps in part because I do feel it is the most misunderstood and most myth-filled war, perhaps, in history, if not American history. So we go to the cause. We can certainly say that one existing belief is that it was exclusively a war of emancipation or a war over slavery. In my humble opinion, any military conflict that I have ever studied in my life, I virtually cannot remember a single one that had a cause. The first thing, in my opinion, to remember is that almost every conflict in world history had a number of causes that accumulated and built up to what I like to say is the irreversible spark. Any conflict that I look at, virtually any conflict that I look at, has a specific point of no return. Now there is a guarantee of war with perhaps no resolution short of it. This war, as I just described, is no different than that, and I feel there is a spark. There will be individuals that will say, oh, well, Fort Sumter was the spark. As soon as there was a shot fired, well, I won't elaborate on that particular. Fort Sumter was not even the first shots fired in the Civil War. So again, on the specialized subject of causes, another one brought up is, well, the territories. There's new Western territories out in the world, and whether or not these are going to be designated as free states or slave states or whatever, this is a recipe for war. I absolutely disagree. In one of the admitted few instances to where I wholeheartedly agree with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis would say the term expansion of slavery is a facetious term. And what he meant by that is that by and large, or again, my favorite word again, virtually, there is virtually no desire whatsoever to expand the institution of slavery into the Western territories. And I also make the extra specific point in this of being agricultural. New Mexico, Arizona, these are not climates conducive to, let's say, Kentucky or Tennessee or even the Deep South, where expansion of slavery is literal, is in congressional and representative representation. A somewhat both fictional and factual fear in the South is that, well, the North is ganging up against us. They are looking to create more and more and more and more and more free states to where it resembles the old French trilogy, particularly to where, well, the clergy and the nobles will always outvote the peasants. And this is a fear in Southern culture. So here is where, for example, previous to Abraham Lincoln, Buchanan, who has all sorts of opinions said about him, tries to maintain an absolute even 50-50 across the future creation of states, and not until the late 1850s does he start putting out that it should be up to the states, which will lead to our bleeding Kansas, etc., so forth. So where I do say the expansion of slavery is a literal term is because the South is insisting that the creation of states be balanced for representation purposes. Is this a cause of war? Is this, I would say absolutely not. This is administrative. For those that say it was completely a war of slavery under misguided terms or hidden, but this is the point. I would say that one only needs to look to the 1859 Lincoln-Douglas debates to absolutely blow that out of the water. Lincoln will state in the 1859 debates that he in no way is ever going to support black citizenship, black voting, black office holding, positions of any authority such as law enforcement, marshals. He and many more, much more by modern context, controversial statements regarding race in these debates, that even if you are as open-minded as I am and say, well, maybe there was more going on and it is a politician and this is what he's saying, that still at this point in time, this is absolutely, again, not a war aim of the administration. And I would like, by a show of hands, just out of curiosity, who here is familiar with either or both the Moral Tariff Acts or the Port Tariff Acts? My astounding, or I am utterly astounded, not that every historian agrees with me, not that every scholar agrees with me, that is not the point. The point is that the subject is never brought up. And I would like to emphasize the absolute utter importance in this. And with time permitting, I'm going to have to give a simplified description of 1860 and its relevance to the Port Tariff Acts. In 1860, there is no income tax. It does not exist. The federal treasury receives all of its money. The entire federal treasury comes from primarily two sources. Approximately 15% of the federal treasury is funded, supported by property taxes. Property owners who have to pay their property tax every year makes approximately, I emphasize that word, 15% of the federal treasury. Approximately 85% of the federal treasury is funded from port tariffs. That means European shipping coming to North America. Imagine yourself as a merchant owner, business owner, not necessarily on the ship, but as an owner. Your goods come into Wilmington, New York, Boston. When you come into these ports, you have to pay a tariff. You have to pay this money for you to unload and commence trade. In December of 1860, South Carolina says, we're going to secede. Oh my gosh, this is crazy. South Carolina has been saying that since the ink was still wet on the Declaration of Independence. Now it is actually seeming to be a possible reality here. South Carolina, perhaps irrationally or unrealistically, sees themselves as we are going to create ourselves as an independent nation, which I would say even in 1860, every state in the Union, North or South, still considers itself to be. Ratification, colonial ratification, in no way did any state ever give up any of its sovereign state rights. December 1860, well before, to be literal, South Carolina says, well, you know, we're nowhere near able the size to be ranked up there with the empires of Spain, England, France. What can we do to literally be set apart and considered an independent nation? South Carolina says, I've got it. We will be the first state, nation, port to declare tariff-free ports. Someone can say, well, I don't feel they should have the right to do that in the cause of good nation. As far as legality goes, law is on the side of South Carolina. They have the right to do this. In my humble opinion, Abraham Lincoln wants war. He goads for war. He seeks war. In Abraham Lincoln's defense, I would say, completely symbolically here, Lincoln just comes into office, he puts his feet up on the desk. We're here, boys. The Black Republican Party is now the presidential party of the country. And before he can even celebrate, South Carolina is declaring tariff-free ports. In my humble opinion, unless someone, please welcome, because I've always looked for a fourth, I haven't found it. This gives Lincoln 3 options. Completely revamp the entire national treasury system. I don't like the word impossible. This is virtually impossible. If one was even able to do it, I would venture to say, not being an economist specialist, this is probably 10, 15 years to even have it fully implemented, to make such a drastic change. So either A, completely revamp the national treasury system and how the government gets its money. B, blockade South Carolina with a naval fleet, which the North is not ready to do yet, nearly at this stage, just for South Carolina's border, which is a nationally accepted act of war. You do not have to fire a shot. You do not have to unload troops. Today, if U.S. ships were to go and sit out and just blockade any national port, this is universally accepted as an act of war. Thirdly, we can invade. Lincoln will choose the second and the third option. Once again, I state in this situation, and this is where I would argue and say, well, the South unwittingly gave Lincoln what he needed with the firing on Fort Sumter. Absolutely not. This can still be negotiated. This can still be resolved through discussion, through diplomacy. But in my humble opinion, the spark of this war, the cause, as I said before, the causes of the Civil War is a wagon wheel. You have slavery, territories, agricultural, cultural differences. But the spark to where there is no return, if you did want to use the phrase, the South unwittingly gave Lincoln all he needed, I would insist that this is the spark. This is the premier cause of a number of causes which forces war. If South Carolina will not step down, I've offered my 3 choices that I believe in Lincoln's defense is all that he can do. And one of them is virtually impossible. And as I had said, my bewilderment is not that historians or anyone even in this audience says I wholeheartedly agree. That's an absolute fact, what you just said. That's not what I'm seeking. The fact is it taught in school? Is it taught in college level? Is it taught anything? It's not even mentioned. I have great faith that everybody here in this society tonight has exceeding knowledge on this subject. And I did not get one single hand that said they'd ever even heard of this fact. Where once again, I openly consider the possibility that money, power, and control being the causes of a war, well, that's absurd. It can't be money. It can't be economics. With what I state here, this is what I truly believe is the spark, the point of no return. Anything previous to this is still negotiable. It's still able to be worked on through diplomacy. Other myths and misconceptions, in my opinion, is, or excuse me, back to go, so, well, that's all you're going to say about slavery. Well, once again, I will only share facts here, which may muddy the waters and not make any clarity out of anything. I would also, very interactively, ask here, anyone in our audience today, I'll even give the first answer and say, there was only 3 pieces of legislation throughout the entire duration of the war that had any mention of slavery whatsoever in it. Can anyone here please raise a hand and tell me what were these 3 pieces of legislation? And don't humble yourself, because I'm very confident that everyone in here knows at least one.
Emancipation Proclamation.
The Emancipation Proclamation, of course. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of 3. The first legislation passed that had any mention whatsoever. And I will give the example here. In 1861, if Captain such and such is serving in the Confederate Army, and Union Army forces have the ability to reside on his property, to occupy the area, simply by serving in Confederate uniform, or even exaggeratingly secessionist period, but most notably, most literally, any individual serving in the Confederate Army or aiding the Confederate Army in any way, we can take his house, we can take his property, we can take his livestock, his chickens, his hogs, his peaches, all of his property can become property of the federal government. And then General Benjamin Butler will present to the U.S. administration, well, if we can take all of that property, can we not take slave property as well? Property is property. I have been told in the past that, well, the Declaration of Independence, the Bills of Rights, that has nothing to do with slavery. It does not include the slavery, or that the Confederate Constitution is almost identical to the U.S. Constitution, other than it includes slavery. The Constitution lists from the Founding Fathers property. A great faction of the Founding Fathers were slaveholders. Property is property. For this argument from someone, then you're telling me that you expect that the U.S. Constitution, or the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers, if that's what they meant, they would have said property, including slave property. I'm going to use the word absurd again. Property is property. There's no distinction. Slavery in 1860 only just recently went to the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision, which included other factors, not just the existence of slavery. But even in this case, more specifically, which I find ironic that Dred Scott had absolutely no interest in this case whatsoever, stated that the Supreme Court reiterated that Slavery or the institution is a U.S. guaranteed right. Same as voting. Same as freedom of religion. This is reiterated by the Supreme Court. So this is where I find, well, the U.S. Constitution made no illusions towards slavery whatsoever. Please. So Benjamin Butler puts his proposal forward. War Department, Abraham Lincoln says, absolutely. This brings us to a new term, contrabands. What is the great myth to the name contraband? People will say, well, contrabands are slaves that the Union Army came into the area and freed and liberated. Absolutely not. Contrabands are slaves that are seized by the United States government as federal property. They are not given an option. They are not given freedom. They are taken into federal usage, mostly for field labor, teamsters, building fortifications, etc., so forth. To this particular slave, the only thing that changed in his world was who his master was. I'm often asked by individuals that say, well, did the Confiscation Act, it surely bettered the lives of the slaves. Once again, in perhaps my absurd, widespread opinion or way of thinking, I say the only answer I could give to that is I am sure it made many slaves' lives better. It made many slaves' lives much worse. It depends on the situation of which this slave came from. But that is the first Confiscation Act. And once again, I am a word literalist. The Confiscation Act. What does confiscation mean? It does not mean emancipation. Were some slaves contrabanded at some point during the war and let free? I would absolutely never use the word never. I am absolutely sure some were. But by policy, by action, by this first year of the war, no, this is a labor service totally provided to the United States government, which also allows fighting able soldiers to take military posts and not have to do the support positions necessary and labor positions, which many patriotic soldiers had very much opposition to doing. So again, simply just a clarification on a term. The only three pieces of legislation was the first Confiscation Act, the second Confiscation Act, and the Emancipation Proclamation. I think there is great effort or openness or common knowledge out there that to oppose what I actually had a high school history teacher tell me. I happen to be grading papers of my own, working on things, and I overheard his classroom, and the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves. Most of us know that is not true. Because I know, it did not free the slaves in the border states of Maryland and Kentucky, and therefore, or of Unionists. Oh my goodness, there were Unionist slaveholders? Of course there were. What is not as much known is that when the Emancipation Proclamation is issued, yes, the border states are exempt. If you are Unionist and you are friendly to the Republican Party, you are exempt. If you are in a federal occupied area, such as the city of New Orleans, which falls early in 1862, New Orleans is under federal occupation. You are now exempt. The Emancipation Proclamation only pertains to areas to where the federal government has no control. So, with all these extreme exemptions, and I even actually approached this teacher and I said, you know, I understand studying for the test. I understand at a high school level, you spend 4 days maybe on the Civil War and try to explain a subject that I find is so absolutely complex that I don't know if I'm up to the 20-yard line after 40 years of studying it. And I said, you know, but gee, you know, I'm sure you know the Emancipation did not free the slaves. And he said, well, yes, it did. I said, no, it didn't. It claimed that some slaves were free, but it actually did no action whatsoever in particularly freeing any slaves. I said, the first piece of legislation on a piece of paper that even does that, proclaiming that in this country, is the 13th Amendment. And this high school teacher told me, honestly, it's the same thing. The Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment is the exact same thing. Opinions. This is for causes. Another subject that I do, because one of my lectures is strictly on politics, personalities, psychologies, events, battles. Another one is tactics. For short purposes, complete myths. I look at the Learning Channel or the History Channel that tells me people were so stupid back then because the weaponry had evolved far more ahead of the tactics. And the age of the bayonet is long over with this advancement. As a tactical specialist, I argue this fact, absolutely not. In my humble opinion, notice I do say opinion anytime I feel my opinion is involved, that this shows me a complete misunderstanding of the tactics. These are professional soldiers with the technology of the day. There is new technology available here, so it does take figuring out how to best utilize, but to say that the age of the bayonet is over, absolutely not. They will still be using the bayonet in World War I, 50 years later. The bayonet plays a particular psychological part. We all know that these are single-firing weapons. A crack soldier can fire perhaps 3 rounds a minute. I have a small, very crude diagram here. This represents a regiment. Each individual block, size not relevant, ignore the size of the blocks. But each of these represents a regiment in battle line. 3 to 5 regiments would make a brigade. 3 to 5 brigades would make a division, etc., etc. This shows 3 regiments facing each other. Each green dot on the right top corner of these boxes represents a company commander, such as a captain, as the war goes on, lieutenants, etc. Each regiment is divided into 10 companies. A company, on paper, on the first day of the war, a company is 100 men. 10 companies put together makes a 1,000-man regiment. This simulates 3 regiments facing each other. The C and the LCs represent the colonel and the lieutenant colonel's position each commanding essentially a wing or half of the regiment when the regiment is engaged and firing. As a company commander, I'm one of these green dots. Movies, we see colonels, generals. Why, not to pick on anyone, please. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain is on the firing line, firing his pistol on Little Round Top. Never mind that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in his own account said he never carried a pistol during the war. But those irrelevance aside, as a company commander or even as a regimental commander, did lines stand and swap fire and pour fire into each other? Yes, it did happen. This is not the science of war. We see this in The Patriot or any other linear age battle movie of two lines standing and just pouring straight ahead into each other. This is not officers' responsibilities and jobs being done. As a regimental commander, for example, I don't want to sit and swap fire across the field with a regiment because I'm going to I am going to receive as much damage as I'm going to inflict. The object is to find a way to create more damage. And what I mean by this in example is that as this commander, I'm not going to have my men firing straight across the field. I'm going to say, I want Company A delivering fire in this direction. I want Company B firing towards that flank. Company C, I want them firing here. I want them firing here. They can shoot ahead. This one shoots over there. I'm creating a crossfire enfilade at any opportunity that I'm able to do this with. What is my goal as a commander? Once again, it is not to swap fire. My goal is to do this and fire with the hopes that I see a dreadfully weakening spot in this line. If I can create this weakening spot in this line, this battle line is going to be spending more energies to concentrate their men and close these holes. This is a reduction in the firepower that's coming at me. I want you to have to fix your lines more than focus on firing on me. Well, you know, Federals wore blue and Confederates wore gray. Absolutely not. If we were to see realistic troops back then, you would see so many array of colors and whatever that you see. Yes, fundamentally, most Federals did have blue issues. After the first year of the war, where units like the 12th New York wore gray, and that aside. The whole point of why uniforms didn't really matter in essence, and the soldier people worry about it more today than the soldiers did, is because the line that I belong to is a mile long, with a flag half as big as this wall flying over my head. The buttons that I have on my jacket are not a factor, I promise you. With this being said, yes, there is aiming being done, but the understanding of linear warfare, it's not aiming at particular targets. It is concentration. I want to control the fire of my line to where I have concentrated, tight hailstorms of lead coming in. Because, well, we all know that the only reason that the colonists were able to defeat the greatest wartime army of the time in Great Britain was because, well, Americans weren't stupid. They didn't fight in linear lines, and they didn't wear bright red uniforms. I also have a lecture of direct parallels and myths between the War for American Independence and the War for Southern Independence, more relevant for that lecture, but my point in that is absolutely, completely false. The colonial army, regular army, fought in the exact same style that the British Army did. It is European linear tactics. The problem is, England has the greatest well-supplied army, debatably, in the world, And we can't match that. Half the people that I've got coming for colonial service do not have solid military weapons. They're bringing in little slender, tiny Kentucky and Pennsylvania rifled muskets. Well, then we've got to use them how we can. We cannot face massed military troops with this weaponry. Put them up in the trees, put them up to whatever. These are not a huge factor and has virtually no significant effect in the colonials defeating the British in the war. My point again is that it is about volume. Volume of fire, a hail, because that same individual might tell me it would make more sense to spread the men out. If you spread the men out, that's what we do today. We learned that we were stupid back then, and all of these professional soldiers that many went to West Point or Virginia Military Institute or the Citadel and learned the trade on the absolute most modern aspects of warfare just were all stupid people. This is their career and their profession, but they're just stupid. No, it's because if I spread my people out, well, we're not taking as many mass casualties. But again, that's not what is going to achieve the goal. Now I've spread out my fire. Now I have a person dropping here and a person dropping there. Oops, we got another one down there. That's not what I want. I want concentrated hail blowing a gap 20 yards long in a line if I can, because 20 yards or from here to the table in actual combat is very difficult effort and time consuming to get these men to shift in their draining, to reconcentrate, to maintain their maximum fire. It's the weapons of the time. Well, why don't we fight in shoulder to shoulder today? Because the weapons that we have today can produce that devastating volume of fire. Volume is the key. Well, this was a long-winded from your tactical lecture, Brian. I thought it was about the bayonet. Well, yes, I'm coming to that because, all right, I'm inflicting damage. Now I've got a wavering hole. A big important thing to remember is, well, Brian would like to stand up and say, I'm as brave as the next man next to me. I'm willing to die for my country, my flag, my home. And when I look, and there is a perfectly shoulder-to-shoulder concentrated ranks of 1,000 bayonets or more coming, advancing, and they are shoulder to shoulder. Their officers are in the proper places. Their formation is set. Their flags are flying. Their color bearers are there. Heck, they're playing music in the back. And I look over here, and my file mate, the man next to me in the ranks, is over at that table. And I look, and there are holes left and right, and my line does not look like their line. I'm still brave. I'm still willing to die. Not today, not this way. He's peeling, I'm willing to stand here, but if everybody else is peeling, I'm peeling too. There is another fundamental. Chess is a game completely based on linear warfare. What is the goal of chess? To remove pieces, to eliminate the king's power. It's not necessarily, yes. Warfare, especially in the linear age, is about killing as many as you can and it's causing as many casualties as you can with the least casualties to your side. But I do not have to, and it's unrealistic to say you're going to drop every man on that field. My goal is to create disruption. If you can get them breaking and fleeing, and virtually any Civil War commander, I'm not going to pick favorites, knows this science. They are trained in this. But perhaps the greatest understander or actual the greatest implementer of this perhaps was Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was about doing this quickly. I want to get in there, I want to cause devastating damage. When I see the area that is devastatingly damaged, everybody cease fire, load, everybody loaded at once. Aim on this particular spot of the field. Now you have every company unleashing a devastating volley into this weakening part of the line, devastating it, much like a boxer's left hand jab with the right come at what is that right overhand? The bayonet charge. Devastating, blowing volley that you're looking about how to restore my line, and they are already just crashing into us. There is the principle of the bayonet. And the bayonet does not have to cause the damage. It is human psychological. This weapon pointing at you with a .58 caliber round in it, or even what the damage of the rest of this weather can do to you as a hand weapon, should be intimidating enough. But somehow in the human mind, there's something more intimidating about that glistening bayonet. And soldiers themselves even said that they would be much more willing to take wounds from artillery or rifle fire than the thought of using the bayonet. Tom Chamberlain, for example, as a sergeant in the ranks, in his own writings, says that we trained with it. I could never use it. If I was ever in the position, I could never use the bayonet on another man. Another myth in tactics. Well, there were very few bayonet wounds in the Civil War because the troops with the new technology barely came into hand-to-hand combat like that. Absolutely ridiculous. Hand-to-hand combat is going on from 1861 to 1865. Troops are getting into hand-to-hand combat. Bayonet wounds do not compare to artillery or rifle fire wounds in percentage, but I also do maintain that I believe bayonet wounds are underrepresented in statistics. Another key reason why were bayonet wounds as low as they were, because if I am in genuine close quarter combat with a bayonet, you can see for me to even use it at my best, it is very unwieldy. Often these hand-to-hand issues have crowds of men together. In this situation, was the bayonet used? It absolutely was. In close quarter combat, most soldiers turned around to the butt end. The butt and the hammer itself makes a devastating weapon that can be used at close quarters without having to maneuver a 5-foot weapon. Another reason for low bayonet statistic keeping, most statistics that we accept, well, there were 53,000 some men killed at Gettysburg. There was 23,000, etc., killed at Sharpsburg in our bloodiest day in American history. There were approximately 625,000 men killed during the war. Every single one of these figures, in my opinion, to some degree, is low. Any figure that you read is low, in my opinion. Because where do these figures come from? Essentially, they come from two sources: field hospitals and regimental musters. I get up in the morning, I count my men, I give roll call, who's missing. Many accounts have, or personal accounts of other soldiers, said I saw Bill go down, it was due to a rifle shot in the throat, blah, blah, blah. These are written down. But for sake of conversation, the bayonet is specifically designed the way it is designed. But to make a point, The three-sided bayonet is designed the way it is. It has a groove here completely intentionally, and it was three-sided for a particular reason. This weapon is exactly as period correct. It is a two-sided, much rarer issued weapon with a two-sided bayonet, or excuse me, yes, a two-sided bayonet. Just out of a show of hands for activity. None of us wants to meet the business end of either one of these. In the idea of survival, show of hands, who believes that you would have a better chance of survival with this weapon? Okay, we've got a decent percentage. Who here would believe that you would have a better chance? It's much smaller, it's not as big or daunting as that. Who here thinks you would have a better chance of survival with this weapon? Absolutely not. It's three-sided for a purpose, because it will create a wound like this to where, in the best case scenario, a suture, if this even heals correctly, the other side won't. You cannot get a closed seal. At least by taking a wound with this weapon, your wound is shaped like this, and you have the potential of a sewn up wound that sutures and heals correctly. It's designed three-sided to almost ensure fatality. And the groove down the middle, that's designed in there specifically to act as a bleeder, so that if you do use the weapon, it has an open flow and doesn't pent up any blood that could possibly clot or help in closing that wound. What is my point with this unfortunate graphic information? Is that if I am out in the field with a loved one, my brother, my friend, my comrade, and he takes a bayonet wound, especially anywhere in the torso or abdomen, this is an almost guaranteed fatality. So we're out fighting on the top of the mountainside, in the woods, on the hills. Of course, I am going to get him, try to throw him over my shoulder, and try to carry him, bouncing him the whole way, 3 miles back to the aid station to... No, probably what I'm going to do is make him as comfortable as I can by a tree, give him a canteen of water if I can. And in this scenario, well, yes, there's someone who witnessed his death. I can report it to my officer. We can write him down, and he is a documented casualty and cause in the war. How many men did not have that? So again, my point, all numbers, maybe only one off. But I believe all numbers are lower than what is accepted. Oh my goodness, and our time does fly so very much. I would also like to mention a lecture that I have, which is the personalities and psychologies of individuals in the war. What I like to emphasize in this particular segment, which I hope to just give a sampler of interest to everyone here, as the entire lecture is geared to do, because I will have to move on to something that I do think trumps in interest, but I will mention it. Stereotyping and pigeonholing of Civil War personalities. McClellan was timid, he was slow, he wasn't a good general. I would argue that fact. Ambrose Burnside, the Learning Channel told me on one day, was the worst general in American history. Absolutely unfair. If I had an all-star fantasy team core, Ambrose Burnside and George McClellan would both have jobs in my corps. It is absolutely unfair to McClellan. I do believe in this case, just to allude as to what this particular lecture goes into, is human experience. What makes these people who they were? Who we are and our values and our beliefs and everything that we have stems, in my opinion, from primarily two things. Whether we listen to it or not or believe it, what people tell us and what we experience in life. This shapes these human beings, not marble statues, the same way. George McClellan, for example, I would say perhaps George McClellan would say, my number 2 goal in the world is to absolutely win this war for the Union, have the entire world say George McClellan is the greatest general since Napoleon Bonaparte, which I am, by the way, and maybe even a presidency. That's my secondary goal. My first goal is I am never going to be whipped and thrashed and routed like all of my predecessors before me. You will never rout and whip me and ruin my reputation. George McClellan, I would argue, is perhaps the only general on either side that never had what I call his dog dark day. No one ever routed George McClellan. Well, that's because he was too conservative. That was because he was too cautious. That's because he did. Maybe. Can you take this away from the general? I would say virtually every general in the war had their day. Grant had many of them, particularly or symbolically Cold Harbor, Pope at Second Manassas. These are absolute routs. Burnside, 13,000 at Fredericksburg to 5,000 casualties. And yes, I'm ready for the person to say, Lee at Pickett's Charge or Gettysburg. Absolutely not. I would argue that. Robert E. Lee's dog day, because he had one too, was Malvern Hill at the end of the 7 Days campaign. He is absolutely, his men are absolutely devastated and destroyed by artillery, which leads to another important word for other lectures, I'm sorry to say, is information. Based on the information that one is provided. Well, McClellan always over-exaggerated troops. McClellan did not over-exaggerate troops. He's not out riding there out by himself, doing his own reconnaissance. There is a federal agency totally designed to give him his information with their own mathematical system of how to derive numbers of the opposition as it is, and then fluff it up too, because we can't be accounted as like a contractor and say there were more Confederates than you told us. So we're going to use our system and make sure that we're never under. Just a snippet of personality, but he will always have these pigeonholed statements, these etc. Was he too cautious? Perhaps. That's arguable. That's debatable. But the fact is, he did care for his troops. He did take care of his troops. He tried to minimize his casualties, and he was always cautious. Ambrose Burnside. I don't have time to go into the personalities. Ambrose Burnside will still have a job into 1865, despite the fact that for the Fredericksburg campaign, Burnside has a very good plan. It's a very good plan. It's not brilliant. DC's here, Richmond is there, I'm gonna march in a straight line. It's not brilliant, but it's sound, it's professional, he has it all, and he is absolutely and totally let down by Lincoln, Stanton, and the War Department, and Halleck. His bridges don't arrive, he's got an excellent plan, his entire plan is completely out the window because Washington, D.C. does not support him or do the job or give him what he's already said. If we watch the movie Gods and Generals, well, you know, he should have listened to Hancock, he should have listened to Franklin. They told him, let's start getting troops across and secure a beachhead and whatever. Burnside does not have the luxury to alter the plan. It took him 3 months to create this plan. He's giving it to Lincoln. Lincoln is tired of his previous commanders. You're here to fight. You're here to attack. I want you to attack, attack, attack. Burnside even took 1 minute to say, hey, the situation has changed. Lincoln would have said, I don't even want to hear it. You're relieved. I need somebody who's going to fight. I need somebody who's going to attack. That's what I'm looking for. And on, I have a great number of individuals of why Grant was the man he was. Well, he's the hardcore soldier, not into dress uniforms, and he's willing to stick it. There's reasons for this, and it's not he was just a soldier. He went out and bought himself the most gaudy, fluffy, epauletted uniform that anybody ever bought in his life when he got an officer's commission. But it's the human experiences that happen that shape what these individuals become. And so much more I would like to do on that particular subject, but in that psychology and why the men were the men that they were, and Abraham Lincoln specifically, there are vast things by reading their upbringing, their life experiences that shape, and I'm not even saying a fact, the pieces fit. I really have to conclude very quickly here. And so what I would like to finish with is, namely because, well, in Pennsylvania, there's always one subject which may be of very much interest or exceeding interest, and I would also go as far as to say it is one of the most absolute myth-filled campaigns of the war. And I would like to make a couple simple points and make a very early conclusion so that everyone has an opportunity for any questions and answers. This particular battle, let the mystery and the drum rolls roll, is Gettysburg. In Gettysburg, we will say that we have our traditional fishhook position. Here is the initial Confederate position. This is not timely or perfect. It is here at the end. My point here is I am trying to make a very bold, thick formation. And if we watch the movie Gettysburg, oh gosh, I'm such a movie pounder, aren't I? I'm sorry, but Lee was stupid. He orders Longstreet's assault on day 3, or Pickett's charge, which is absolute insanity, doomed to failure, because it is a Napoleonic style assault, and we all know that Napoleonic assaults are absolutely stupid with the new weapons that we have and outdated tactics. I will not insult you by telling you my opinion or my favorite A word on that. Again, absurd. He should have listened to Longstreet. Tom Berenger told him, and to the credit, Longstreet himself in period time, yes, is insisting and asking, because on day 1, a big myth of Gettysburg. First myth. Day 1, the Confederates will attack the left side. Day 2, they will attack the right side with our big and our little round top. Day 3, Lee has attacked both sides, so he knows that they must be taking from the center to make those strong, so I am going to attack the center. I can't say entirely wrong, largely incorrect. Day 1, there is no federal line lower than this point. The battle is on the left because this is where the meeting engagement takes place. On day 2, Lee will see this. He believes the end of the Union line is right there. This is our peach orchard and our wheat field and all that good stuff right down there. So on day 2, Lee will say, I am going to have Ewell and the 2nd Corps engage up here at first thing in the morning. Longstreet, you are to take the 1st Corps, come down here, find the flank of the Union Army, and attack the right flank. And we will have basically a two-sided pincer. I love James Longstreet. He is one of the greatest corps commanders of the entire war. On July 2nd, James Longstreet is absolutely in a cantankerous, unworkable snit. He is disgusted. He doesn't, I think everybody here has had that day where you went to your job and you said, you know what? I just don't want it. This will be day 2 for Longstreet. Longstreet does not like this entire plan. Longstreet wants to disengage from the army, pull everybody back in front of a fortified enemy, and ideally go towards Washington, D.C. and find somewhere of our choosing so I can have another Fredericksburg in my position and just mow them down all day long. Lee is engaged here. Short version anyhow. So Longstreet doesn't like this plan. Again, human nature. I love Longstreet. The man is a professional. He is a great soldier. He is a great commander. He is a human being. I have a better plan. I actually am possibly a better general than Robert E. Lee, and he should be listening to me. He's not listening to me. Ewell in the 2nd Corps engages first thing at dawn in the morning. James Longstreet is supposed to be attacking here by 8 a.m., 9 a.m. as best as he can. Longstreet will dawdle. He will not even get his men moving for hours while these men are engaged up here, because what they're trying to do, and what Lee is consciously saying, is we need to have pressure on both sides, or they're just going to bring all their men up here and support. This is what we call interior lines. This is what we call exterior lines. The Confederates are outnumbered by a full third of their army, and they have the longer outside exterior line. Longstreet, I cannot carry on too much about all the myths and what's wrong with this situation, but Longstreet will come down here. It's not even the flank. Things have changed. They're all the way down there. My point being, on day 2, this is the field that will be Longstreet's assault or Pickett's charge. This will be fought and attacked over all on July 2nd. If our movie Gettysburg was accurate, when they're looking at the copse of trees, there are barely any rail fences still standing. There are sections that are. Most of the fences have been destroyed or used for campfire, and the field is littered with bodies from July 2nd. Then Longstreet is forced to come down here. So he's trying to cover this entire area and attack. This will have to be for my Gettysburg lecture someday, but here is the fault. This is one of the things that really starts deteriorating the ability of the Confederates to win this battle, as they are getting way too far extended against a force that outnumbers them and has the interior line. For Longstreet's assault itself, do I believe Longstreet's assault was the best? Should we have listened to Longstreet? Very quickly, what Longstreet is proposing after July 2nd is that we pull back, we stop, and I'm going to take my 1st Corps back here, and we're going to travel all the way around here and move around the right and come in behind the Federal left. This is what Longstreet will argue for 2 days. If the Union Army was going to sit there and do absolutely nothing and let you move at will, this has a low chance of success. What you're talking about is totally disengaging. Robert E. Lee's great success for over 2 years of the war is because he successfully implements Napoleon's tactic of destroying in detail. That means destroying this piece and turning on this piece. Create separation, catch them when they're separated, destroy one with your whole force, then turn on the other with your whole force. What Longstreet is proposing here, You're doing it for them. You are breaking our consistency. We have to stay together. If you divide here, half of this federal force can swing up and absolutely annihilate this force before you're even this far on your trek. It's insane. Another thing that I would say that I like to emphasize very quickly is the point here is that, let's say on July 2nd, we know Hood will make a protest to Longstreet. Well, all they have to do is roll rocks down on us. I don't like this. Longstreet says I don't like it either. I've been trying to get something else for 2 days. If the Union Army goes to sleep for over 24 hours, does not realize that half of the Army just evacuated their front, and sits there and does absolutely nothing, while Longstreet comes all the way around here to the right. And hey, I'm reporting, we got here, we're here. Well, the first thing that I'm going to say that people don't realize about Gettysburg, there are 2 things that the Confederacy, the Army of Northern Virginia, does not have. They do not have artillery ordnance except for really one good fight, maybe a little bit more. 2, they're out of time. That is the most important. Whatever we do, we have to do it now. Now. Well, I've arrived here in the back of the line. What do? I'm ready to, well, first thing, have all the men stack arms together because you're not fighting today. Because give them all axes, you're going to have to cut down trees, you're going to have to do work to get your artillery up there. You don't send infantry in with no artillery support. So today is lost. My humble analogy here is, okay, I have arrived here, and right now, the Union Army has 10,000 men on my front in grade C fortifications. So we can't attack against that. So we're going to spend the day, cut down trees, bring up artillery. By tomorrow, there are now 20,000 there in grade B fortifications. Well, I can't attack against that. That's worse than it was yesterday. So I better cut down trees, not use today, try to get farther around them. Now I've got 30,000 in grade A fortifications. My point being, they are making better use of the time every minute that you are not doing something. This is where I say, General Longstreet's proposal. General Longstreet is a brilliant, smart career general. My humble opinion, Longstreet does not even believe in this. He's not hoping that Lee will take that or whatever. He knows he's a professional. I am going to say pretty darn confidently, as good as Brian Keator is, I'm no James Longstreet. He knows his job, he knows his career, he knows his business. This is absolutely insane. It's impossible. If you wanted to hand the Federal Army something with the greatest chance of absolutely annihilating this entire army, this is the best plan to do. So why does Longstreet say it? Longstreet, in my opinion, dawdles on July 2nd. He does not attack until 4 p.m. Culp's Hill, which is the prime real estate, I can't get all of these things in, of Gettysburg, has been fighting for nearly 8 hours by the time Longstreet is even in line. Culp's Hill is the only place on the battlefield where they fight all 3 days. So this is absurd. Well, if I dawdle, if I take my time, and I'm not in position 4 hours after I'm supposed to, Lee's going to say, whoa, 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 the plan isn't going to work. I'm stopping my plan. Pete, what should we do? What's your opinion? I got it all planned out here, General. Day 3, Longstreet's assault. Longstreet is put in command. Longstreet sadly fails in his job. He does not even do it. I'm not doing my job today. when they deployed those troops. Think people who don't understand the science of deployment as it depicted in the movie. I want you to do your division here in the dirt. Here's Kemper, here's Garnett, here's Armistead. Good. That is a depiction of what James Longstreet's job is. Other than his division, he does not do that anywhere on the field. He does not go and look. You need veterans on your flanks. You need your weakest and beat up units from July 1st in the center so they have support. Longstreet does none of this. He does not look at any deployment whatsoever. That's A.P. Hill's men. A.P. Hill says it's Longstreet's job. He's got the assault. A.P. Hill doesn't. Longstreet's assault, those men are sent forward with absolutely no organization, no deployment, no, they're just put in the lines and sent forward. I really have to close on that. So much more, and I hope that there might be genuine interest in the Gettysburg myth lecture, because there is so very much to it. I am a complete supporter that Robert E. Lee's decision for Longstreet's assault on July 3rd is the best opportunity available for success. Available. Thank you very much. I so appreciate your time, your patience. I did in fact run over, as is my way. I would very much like to open up any questions and answers. This can pertain to anything in the lecture. It can pertain to absolutely anything whatsoever not included in the lecture that perhaps you've always wanted to ask. What do you think one of the great myths are? Anything whatsoever. Yes, ma'am.
McClellan, who was at Gettysburg, had McClellan gone after Lee, in story that I hear, we could have ended the Civil War a lot earlier had he pursued. He let Lee retreat.
Very good. I will make.
He went after him. They were at the river and they lost Lee.
I believe, and with just one slight misspeak,
Okay.
You do mean Meade.
I meant Meade.
Yes.
Meade. Meade.
And I would say that is another great myth that is unfair to Meade. Did Meade not pursue the Confederate Army on July 4th when they evacuated? Yes, Meade did. What is not understood or is shortchanging of George Meade is that what people don't consider is, hey, the Union and the Federals won Gettysburg. They're the victors.
Yes.
Lee is disaster. It's absolutely not a disaster. It's 6,000 men. It's not ideal, but there is another one of my myths, I'm sorry to say.
Okay.
Gettysburg is not a disaster to the Confederates. The fact of the matter is, though, is that both of these armies are so devastated. For example, George Meade, you should be up on July 4th, mobilizing your army and marching after Lee.
Yes.
Well, for example, First Corps, Reynolds is dead. Hancock is out. Third Corps, Sickles is out. We've got 3 corps commanders already, 3 corps with no commander of the corps. There has to be assignments, there has to be a session. This is only the corps commanders. Imagine the brigade commanders, the division commanders, colonels, lieutenant colonels, captains, lieutenants. This army is wrecked. This is going to take days to actually repair and get assignments. I can't order organizations to move who don't even have their command structure established. So, what does Meade do? Meade's largest unused force is his cavalry. He sends his cavalry out after Lee immediately on July 4th.
Does he?
Yes, he does.
I thought he hesitated on that.
He did not hesitate with the cavalry.
Oh, the cavalry went out, okay.
The cavalry did go out. And it took him time to reorganize his infantry, and it's still, that was moving within that. It's immense credit to me that he can even have a functioning, retreating is one thing. Retreating, you make the minimal plug-ins that you have to do and you retreat. Lee does not have the time or the luxury to reorganize his army from his devastating losses. He has to work with what he's got. Once again, just to elaborate, not to give anything away, but we could also say in regards to the Gettysburg campaign, because we know from the movie Gettysburg, again, I'm picking, that had the Confederacy had the smashing, routing victory at Gettysburg that they had at First Manassas or Second Manassas, that there's an open road to Washington, D.C., and the Pennsylvania campaign, as I prefer to call it, which culminates at Gettysburg, I will say is a successful campaign. It is a costly campaign. It is a devastating campaign, but it is successful. And again, for my Gettysburg lecture, and not with the time that we have now, which is your time, there were 7 objectives for the Pennsylvania campaign. 5 of them were completely achieved by the Confederate Army. 2 of them were not. In my humble opinion, the 2 objectives that were not achieved in the Pennsylvania campaign, neither Jefferson Davis, maybe optimistic Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee would tell you there is virtually no chance of these 2 objectives. These 5 objectives were all completed. These 2 objectives were destroy the Army of the Potomac and to end the war. The entire, one of the tragedies of the Civil War, which obsessed Robert E. Lee, which obsessed Stonewall Jackson, was the destruction of an army, a chessboard, to take off a piece off of that board that no longer exists. No army was ever destroyed during the Civil War. They are too big. They are too immense. The closest thing that happens is in 1864 in what they call the Gettysburg of the West, with how many people are super well aware of the Battle of Franklin.
Franklin, Tennessee.
Yes, ma'am.
I was there.
Well, and there, outstanding. And there, the Army of Tennessee virtually ceases to exist. It is so devastated that the Army almost doesn't count as an army. It's a withered little chess piece that was already in very bad shape to begin with. Yes, was there?
I was under the understanding one of their objectives, or main objectives, was to get to Scranton to cut off the coal supply, because we were supplying coal to New York and the upper states, and if they could cut that off, coming from Gettysburg.
And very good. And in my opinion on that is that I would say there are 7 major objectives. This is definitely a tied-on sub-objective. If you have the opportunity, we also want to achieve this. We also want to, etc., so forth. Because again, the main objectives that were completed was to get the Federal Army out of Virginia, absolutely completed. To live off of, to absolutely keep all federal forage, rations, everything in complete reserve and live completely off of the federal, off of Pennsylvania, completely achieved. Send more supplies back. Stewart's 125 wagons and other, whatever, completely achieved. The 5 were absolutely and completely achieved. The 2, I believe Robert E. Lee would tell you as he's marching towards Pennsylvania, it's not feasible, it's not realistic. Even if it was a smashing victory, the Union Army is absolutely routed and dispersed. I emphasized time. We don't have the time to sit here and live in Pennsylvania for months. We just used almost all of our ordnance. That is a big thing. We have almost no artillery ammunition whatsoever. If we marched all the way to Washington, D.C., Washington, D.C. will simply pull up all the bridges, which leaves a great big river. We have no pontoon bridges, no way to cross. This would go into a siege, which means we need heavy siege artillery. They don't have any of this. In my humble opinion, the Pennsylvania campaign was never intended to be anything but an immensely large-scale raid.
To the north. High water mark.
Yes, sir.
On the tariffs, the government put tariffs on steel. How much did that affect the South?
You know,
I
I
heard some talk that because of the fact that they put tariffs on the steel to help Pennsylvania's steel industry, that had a big effect on cost and expenses in the South.
I do have to admit that I would say that my knowledge on this particular aspect, because that is an excellent question. Did it have a negative consequence on the South? Absolutely. Another thing that I failed to mention with the tariffs is that there is, I've seen figures out there that say that the South is paying 85% of the share of tariff revenue. Again, I'm a humble, honest man. I'm not an absolute expert on the economy. 85%, that seems high to me. That is not high from records and archive that I've studied or the aspects of economics that I have studied. But what I will say safely with that scary word and rarely used word fact, the South is paying exceedingly disproportionate. They are paying way more for their economic wealth, for their population. They are shouldering the burden of much more than they should be paying. And with that being said, I'm sorry that sways from your direct question. It's a great question. The only thing that I could say is it's definitely damaging to Southern economy, to the Southern business, but to what extent, how much, I would openly admit I couldn't say. That is a fantastic question. Yes, sir.
I have a personal interest in Harper's Ferry, and not to drag everything out, I never recall why the North surrendered at Harper's Ferry and surrendered the whole army. That commanding general that, I know, the South had them down there, you couldn't walk on the street because the sharpshooters would pick you right off in Harper's Ferry, but I just don't know what, he had to have a rationale.
Well, it's very interesting because I will even say that, when you hear of massive surrenders or, the surrender of Charleston during the War for American Independence, how can you surrender when you still have so many able-bodied troops, etc.? I think that's relevant. I will say that Harper's Ferry was not under very skilled or qualified leadership. That is not the whole problem. They were already moderately, even perhaps minimally demoralized. These weren't crack troops. These weren't excellent troops by choice. I think when you look at the prominent hills that surround Harper's Ferry, that was a huge influence, that once those were all occupied with artillery, there is no, could I say 100%, it was an admirable man, it was an admirable qualified man who did it to simply save the lives of his own men. I think it's a factor, I would think. I might go as far as to say that you do not have the leadership that you do have on the other side with the superior, so the culmination, the outcome is already concluded. So with all of these things here, and also again, this is a period too where a big thing is that they couldn't be guaranteed or assured this, but there was the likelihood that they would be paroled. That's another thing I would love to elaborate on with more time, is the actual prisoner exchange system, prisoner developments throughout the war. At least at this point in time, the troops are allowed to be paroled, which is simply signing a piece of paper and saying, I will go home until I get a thing in the mail that says I've been exchanged and I have to go back. So I think these factors came in, that it was a hopeless situation, and by not surrendering, a big factor, at least in strategic competence, is that the federal artillery, which is outnumbered at Harper's Ferry, cannot elevate to counterfire. You're not in a position, unless they were to storm the garrison, to use rifle fire. So it means you're going to kind of sit there while artillery all the way around on the ridges just pours fire into you. Your casualties are going to climb, and you're going to be doing no damage whatsoever.
Well, I will support your position on not training, because my great-grandfather came from Florida, New York in July, was in September at Harper's Ferry in training, lost his arm, and my grandmother told me he lost it in the Battle of Harper's Ferry. Well, he lost his arm before the Battle of Harper's Ferry, and they tell me when he was,
When he was gone.
no, with a rod for his rifle.
It was ramming.
Yeah, and if you didn't get your hand out of there quickly, they suspect he lost his hand, his arm in that. And
Wow.
she always said Harper's Ferry, but he went to Washington, and Christmas Eve in '62, he got discharged, and he re-enlisted in the 5th Army, which is a whole other story. Came out of the war as a sergeant, was in the railroad cut, and a couple of other places. It's like amazing.
Outstanding, and it's the personal stories actually that, not as a plug, but in my books, everything is based on the primary accounts. I delve and delve and delve into primary accounts and culminate with the most interesting stories, with ways of injury and etc. that I hope to have the reader say, wow, I never would have considered that. I thought about bullets, I thought about artillery, but never in my life have I thought about whatever, because these are the things that I uncover in my research. And if you can actually humbly, not arrogantly, get Brian to say, wow, I've never considered that, that's an accomplishment. That is
You always learn.
but outstanding, and another great question. And I'm certainly not going to carry on more or expand myself, but just as a point of interest as well, I do also have also in the actual specific myths and misunderstanding of the war lecture, because this was again a sampling from a whole number of lectures that I do. There is also a medical segment, to where, once again, I might even say almost perhaps as surprising as my weapons or tactics addressment goes into medical as well, because another thing that television or books tells me is there were so many amputations in the linear age was because they didn't have the medical technology that we do today. Absolutely incorrect. Absolutely incorrect. The damage that is caused by a .58 caliber expanding lead bullet, if I am hit in any of my limbs with this bullet tomorrow, there is nothing modern day surgical treatment or medical science can do to save that limb. It virtually, my favorite word, virtually nothing medical. It is the nature of the wound that this creates. It's the shattering of the bone that causes the necessary need to move up and amputate. If an individual was hit with that round today, there is still no option. You cannot repair shattered bone. And that's one of the myths that I say. It's not the fact that so many amputations were done because of the medical, but that's not why. It's because of it, because another overstatement, me being the I'm sorry, obsessive word literalist, well, they had no comprehension of germs in the 19th century. Absolutely false. They know that there's germs. They see germs. They know germs exist. They know what they don't understand is how they live, how they expand, how they don't understand germs. They know they're there. They know germs are what creates gangrene. They know germs are what, that causes sicknesses and health and whatever. What they don't understand is how it works. That's why the bloody blade gets wiped on the apron as you move on to your next patient, is because I know there's germs involved here. We have all kinds of wonderful cures over here to give you the best chance of survival. They don't understand that they're spreading them. They don't understand how it travels, what it thrives on. As early as the Crimean War in 1850s, there's great advancement being made on miasma, or unclean air in hospital spaces, and clean bandages. And so once again, it's an oversimplified statement which doesn't go into the specific details. But, anything else at all on any subject at all? Yes.
Personally, I just want to thank you very much for coming, and could we come up and you could show
Oh,
us
most
one-on-one?
absolutely, please. And again, my absolute pleasure. I mean, I really appreciate the invite here and hope that my lecture was informative and enjoyed. Thank you.
Last summer. And one of their fun things was to have a youth they had